Builds in Fire Emblem Heroes are becoming boring. And look at that, the title of the video. And you know what? That's perfectly fine. I think the way this video is going to come off initially, you know, before you click it, although you're watching it now, is that the direction we're going in is pretty bad, you know, aside from the power creep and a lot of that stuff. But that aside, I think currently when it comes to just keeping units up to date, it's a lot better now than it was maybe, I don't know, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 10 years ago. I don't even know how long this game's been out. 7 years? No. Yes? I don't know. The game's been out for a while, and for a long time, a lot of units were just not really that great. And a lot of them still aren't, to be fair. But with the recent addition of Arcanes that we got last September, it's been more of an upward trajectory for a lot of your generic units, or they have a PRF that people wouldn't consider good, or it was okay at the time, it's not okay now, or it's effy. A lot of these arcanes come with maybe 5 effects. Usually it comes with a guaranteed follow-up and stats, and then they tack on some other stuff. Or in some of the newer ones, you get null follow-up and damage reduction and lull speed defense or anything of the sort there. The point being is that these are pretty much just inheritable PRFs that a lot of these units can use to become a lot more usable now in today's meta, rather than just sitting in your barracks until IS decides to drop a seasonal weapon that maybe has one okay effect. The issue, or at least the one I have, is that because arcanes are pretty much replacing a majority of the PRFs that a lot of these units have, or for the generics that just don't have anything, them and this and that and them, and they're pretty much becoming uniform. And what I mean by that is that there's nothing differentiating one unit over the other outside of maybe color or stats. The only units that are able to have some sort of individuality are the ones that aren't taking up the arcane, but even then they usually have some form of competition, whether that's your Vantage units or your Gale Force units, although the arcane does that, or just nukes in general. There's only so much individuality to go around, basically. However, if it were only just the arcanes that played a role in this, I wouldn't really be talking about it. I'd probably still be talking about it. I needed a video for today. There's also the inheritable passives that play a factor into this. You know, your stuff like Finish, aka just every infantry's A slot, Close Call 4, or any of the Dodge 4 skills. Just a lot of the new inheritables that we've been getting recently that is more so playing into a lot of the skill creep and power creep in general, although power creep isn't really that great right now because every unit nowadays just comes with 5 to 6 effects and they have all sorts of stuff. And because of all these new inheritable passives and arcanes that we've just been getting over time, a lot of the builds and a lot of units are pretty much running the same 1 or 2 things for the most part. There are some differentiations here or there, but more often than not, a lot of these units are running the one set that lets them perform at their highest potential, you know, kind of like far saves with Hardy Fighter and all that stuff just for tanking. It's pretty much going into a lot of the other archetypes. That being said, it's highly arguable that it's always been this way, whether that was with 2020's Distant Counter, Spurn Null Follow-Up Infantry, Hardy bearing AoEs on something like an Aetherite's defense, Fury Desperation builds for Arena Assault clears, or any sort of Triangle Adept breaker skill way back when. There was always some form of consistency even back then. I would say a lot of them were pretty much ran out of the entirety of Fae, mainly because there's so many more effects that just negate so much of their potential, whether that's stuff like Godo with AoE protection, or pretty much every unit being able to run Spurn Null Follow-Up and get maybe 50 to 60% damage reduction per hit. Fury Desperation also isn't really that great outside of PvE clears, although maybe I'll use it every once in a while. But with all that being said, I don't think any of this is a bad thing whatsoever. This is less of a video of me just going in and being like, huh, you run attack speed finish and Close Call 4 and Speed Smoke and Oath 4? What are you, an infantry unit? But rather, I think it's more of an interesting discussion point for where Fae could potentially go. Because in my opinion, rather than trying to make more units unique in a certain archetype, I think creating more archetypes and roles for units to participate in is a much better approach. Fae can only do so much with adding new effects, new counters, that isn't just whatever we had way in the past, but just way more overboard and way stronger. You know, like Bulwark to Obstruct, or damage reduction to even more damage reduction. It's more so just the natural progression of the game, because as the game goes on, there needs to be more power creep so they can sell more units and more toys and make more money. That's kind of how the gacha system works, unfortunately. But that's neither here nor there. The point being is that a lot of the newer additions that we've been getting as of late aren't necessarily new effects, but rather they're just repurposed from older releases. You know, stuff like Life Unending on a drive staff. Yay. And I think this is perfectly fine. So rather than trying to make units unique in their own specific archetype, although stats and all that junk will play a role into pretty much anything you go into, I think creating more roles in the game is a much better compensation, and it can lead to a lot more unit viability that we may not even know until it happened. You remember back in 2021 when we got saviors and we're still using saves because saves are extremely good? How about infantry speed tanks with 80% damage reduction or whatever the hell they get now because they get everything? Even newer skill additions that have made stuff like melee flyers just absurdly strong, such as guard bearing 4 and guidance 4, or even some new toys for ranged armors, although this more so applies to every armor. It helps out the ranged armors a significant amount too, such as Armored Beacon or Savvy 4. I think upgrading older skills and creating new ones is probably the best way they can go forward with just making everyone way more viable in today's meta. Obviously, all the new stuff is going to be better than the old stuff, but that doesn't mean your older units have to suffer as a result. They can still be used to a significant degree. And I want to see that for a lot more archetypes going forward, because any archetype can pretty much thrive in today's meta if they just get the one skill they need. And IS, if you're listening, but you definitely aren't, please, can we get more skills for infantry and armors? They are clearly lacking it. As far as I'm concerned, the only archetypes that are currently lacking in niche are enemy phase cavs, ranged flyers, ranged cavs, staves in general, beasts, depending on the beast, but I'll get into that, and maybe player phase dragons. There's a lot overall that they can improve on plenty of these archetypes that I would love to see. But the question then becomes, what can they be given to excel within the confines of their archetype? Do we get a situation where enemy phase cavs get some form of guard bearing 4 and they pretty much just become flyer 2.0? Or are they given something that, while weaker on the surface, provides a benefit that can't be accessed from a melee flyer? Maybe something with their movement, because as a cav, your movement is arguably the most important thing that you have, but as enemy phase cavs, you're not really taking advantage of it. Maybe something in that regard that can benefit both yourself and an ally, if possible. Ranged cavs with a larger threat range that, while lacking the firepower of an infantry, can gain mobility options or additional effects based on the amount of spaces moved. I don't expect ranged cavs to really tank anything, and they really shouldn't be doing that. Even if the archetype does exist, I guarantee there is a weapon out there that they can use, or they can add into the game, that at least allows them to have more of a player phase presence. You also have the ranged flyers in every beast slot in the world that they can't access because they're a ranged flyer. Ranged flyers and a lot of these other archetypes can become as meta as far saves if they were to just give them the proper skills. I'm not saying they should, although they should. But the question then becomes, what do you really want to give them? You want to give them more warping effects? Because a lot of flyers are generally known for their movement capabilities. You have stuff like aerobatics, guidance. Yeah, those skills. And whether it benefits themselves or allies, it needs to get to a point where they can also participate in their own combats if they are more combative than supportive. Obviously, the ones with PRFs probably aren't going to be struggling as much as a lot of the other ones, although it really depends on the PRF. But with how prevalent stat creep is becoming, a lot of the no follow-up effects that we have, and all the damage reduction stuff that is currently in the game, they need something to stand out from a lot of their other competition. And again, this isn't just ranged flyers, this is a lot of archetypes in general. And I quickly want to talk about staves, because now they have access to a lot more offensive options, including specials, which is great on the surface, until you realize that a lot of them really can't take advantage of their specials because they lack the cooldown acceleration gimmicks, or they lack any sort of skill accessibility that allows them to trigger it really easily. Also, shout out to Holy Pressure for being complete garbage. 3 cooldown is okay on the surface, but then when you realize that saves can't really trigger it outside of Elise, it's a horrible special, and I'm going to stand by that. I think in terms of combat, they are probably one of the more safer options because they have access to fire sweep effects a lot of the time, which is really great. But I find if they're going to pose more of a threat, they're going to need more pressure because chances are they're giving up their beast slot most of the time anyway, and they can't use Spiral 4, which would have been really nice for the infantry ones, but as for pretty much all the other staves, they can't really do much anyway. And really, all I think they need right now is just an easier way of triggering their specials. The infantry ones are fine because they always have access to Times Pulse, and some of the PRF ones have Slaying, so that's not really a bigger issue. But stuff like Brave Camilla and a lot of the other ones that can't access a good amount of the skills are never going to get their special off, and it would be really great if they could. As for the dragons and beasts, they're in a weird spot. I think you could do something great with a player phase dragon if you were going to give them Arcane Grima and do some sort of AoE stuff. I think that would be really cool. But I think in terms of enemy phase dragons, they're not struggling in the slightest. But if you wanted to try something for player phase purposes, at least they have Arcane Grima. Maybe in the future we'll get something there, but I feel like that's one of the least pressing issues. And as for the beasts, they're in the weird spot because all of them get instant PRFs no matter what, and because a lot of the PRFs vary in effects and quality, the exclusive skills that they do get are super general as a result. Some of them are more so catered to faster ones, slower ones, whatever. But there isn't a beast skill that comes to mind that I think, yeah, this unit really excels with it. I feel that the issue is less that beasts are struggling for skill inheritance and more so that they don't do anything in particular that allows them to stand out unless their PRF is really, really good, which, to be fair, that's a lot of units. And I think that's pretty much how it's been since day one. If you have a really good PRF, then you're really, really good. But I would say the difference between maybe the beast and maybe something like a sword is that the swords are generally interchangeable and they are more so uniform in what they can and can't do. A lot of the beasts have varying effects, and what you can do with one beast may not necessarily carry over to another. And maybe they'll get an arcane, but I extremely doubt it. But you know, we've seen weirder stuff in the game. And even if all of this happens, how long until something becomes invalidated? And how much staying power can these rules have as a result of these new additions? Obviously, with newer skills and newer units, some rules are going to fall out of the meta, some we're just never going to see again, and that's okay. I think if the game ends up staying complacent, then it just becomes really boring overall. You know, title of the video. Not really, but at the same time, I would like to see new additions to the game that could always have counters ready to go, but aren't something that are so prevalent that they just can't ever be used. And really what I want to see with the game going forward is more archetypes that are viable and usable. We just got melee flyers just really racking up a lot of viability now because of Guard Bearing 4 and Guidance 4. Why not see it for a lot of these other archetypes? I think it would be very interesting to see more units becoming a lot more usable than seeing the same infantry and armors just excelling for eons and eons. But who knows with IS at this point? It's been 6 years, we don't have a good ranged flyer B slot, and I don't think it's going to happen for another 6 years. But who knows? Maybe they'll drop something in the future that allows me to use, I don't know, this thing, because you know it's not the easiest.